Hey, today I'm going to talk about rent control. And so, actually, many people, lower and upper class alike, seem to think that rent controls are actually beneficial for economies because, on the surface level, what happens is that we all think that since there's a price ceiling, that poorer people can afford these lower prices and move into homes. And that's true in a sense, but also anyone can do that. So, wealthier people move in, save up a ton of money, it becomes more gentrified, and eventually ruins local economies. And so that's what 95% of economists agree on. And so rent control is the act of placing a price ceiling on the house market within a local economy, attempting to create the ideal affordable price by analyzing average income, taxes, gasoline prices, and other things. And so I'm currently a resident here in Berkeley, California. I'm originally from Kansas, but I'm here working in an internship. And actually Berkeley, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all these are rent-controlled cities. And so I've done a lot of research on this topic, and basically my main point is that rent control is a problem, and there has been a history since World War II of how it came to be and how it came to be in place, and how we can go about fixing rent control, us as citizens. And so to start my first main point, like why rent control is a problem. So basically, it hurts the people it's intended to support. So it's supposed to support middle class to lower income families when, in fact, places with a high demand of moving to, so let's say San Francisco, right across the bay, since there's such a high demand and there's a price ceiling, wealthier people are easily available to just move in the city, and they can spend a lower amount of money on housing. So if you're a lower income family, it's going to be much harder for you to get by and compete with the higher income families. And so that's when cities become gentrified and kind of lose the local flavor. And then it also restricts availability of homes and apartments to renters because there's such a high demand and because prices have been lowered. It becomes very dense. And so that leads me to the next point. It discourages new housing construction for all those but the rich. So if you're a landlord and you have like a certain amount of money that you can accept but no higher because the government limits it, that discourages you to build new apartments, new houses for rent, because you're not going to be making any kind of profit because the government is really restricting the supply and demand, how that's supposed to work. And so a quote from John Gilderbloom, 1996, he's an economics guy, says rent control can be the same as a nuclear blast but in very slow motion. So it can really just disintegrate the economics of a city. And so now that we've learned like the negative effects of rent control, what we're going to talk about next is why they were applied in the first place. So it started out in the 1940s after World War II, where we had all of these skilled construction workers in New York City that were building like crazy. So they were building homes and apartments, and the demand was so high to live in New York City that it was getting too expensive, and these skilled laborers were moving out of town. And so New York City was running really dry, and so they're basically just ending up with all these projects that are being built and no one to finish them. And so New York City then placed the first price ceiling, known as rent controls now. And so that's what happened. And so it was aimed at keeping landlords from unfair profiting when troops came back from World War II. And so by the mid-1980s, more than 20% of the United States population lived under rent control, says Tucker William, another famous economist on rent control problems. And so New York City has actually the longest rent control history in the country, dating back to 1943. And rent control is only aimed at large cities where there's a high demand for like residing. So for instance, I'm from Lawrence, Kansas. There's not really a super high demand other than it being a college town. You can find apartments and places to live super easily, really affordable. But San Francisco, where there's a limited amount of space, and they're not building like huge skyscrapers to go up, it just becomes dense, and it ends up costing more and more. So that's why they put rent controls there, to avoid that kind of problem. But it doesn't help. And so with that long history of rent controls existing across the US, so we're going to learn how to combat that. So basically, citizens like me, you, viewers, how we can go about fixing this is being more involved in local politics. And so if we keep our ears open and listen for people who are against rent control that are running for governor or mayor of the cities, and this is a well-known fact. I mean, 95% of economists agree that rent control discourages healthy economies within the local cities. And so with that kind of statistic, it's hard to refute that kind of evidence. So if we as citizens can be aware of the local government, it's a very debated topic. So listening to political candidates who support the outline of rent controls is really good. And be active in voting for political candidates whose has the best interest in the city and not just for raising the profits of the 1%ers who are the most wealthy earners in the town. And so what we can also do is share the awareness of this. So like me giving this speech in front of 5 people, but hopefully, you know, it is a highly debated topic, like I said, and so in conversations you can share what you learned or go online. There's so much info to share, and so getting the awareness out there that it actually is a problem and destroys local economies is really helpful. And so a quote from Block, it says, paradoxically, one of the best ways to help tenants is to protect the economic freedom of landlords. So that's like really interesting to think of, because normally when we think of landlords, we think of like really bossy people who want your money and that's it. But basically, if we protect the economic freedom of landlords, that's the best way to encourage healthy supply and demand economics going back and forth. And that's basically what rent control does. It doesn't allow the healthy, they call it an invisible hand in microeconomics, like pushing supply and demand in different directions. It just stagnates it, and so it causes a lot of misconceptions going on. So we've talked about the problems of rent control, we talked about the history, and talked about what we can do. So I'm just gonna summarize the main takeaways. So rent control not only hurts landlords, it hurts tenants as well. So controlling rent was created to maintain and discourage people with skilled labor from moving out of cities and to discourage overpopulation. And what we can do to fix this is being politically active and knowing which candidates are actually against rent control and can fix this. It is really hard to push out once it is in place, because people do depend on rent controls and stuff like that. So for a clincher, it's a really cool quote I found on YouTube by Nicole Gelinas from Prager University. She says, so rather than dream of the day when New York, Los Angeles, or other rent-controlled cities might abandon this self-destructive urban policy, maybe we should see that this is a cautionary tale that well illustrates a valuable maxim. So what she means by that is, instead of us letting rent control become legal and then having to fight it, is let's learn from it and then not establish it in the first place, because once it is established, it becomes extremely hard to get rid of, because it just becomes unfair for a lot of people that are used to it and live off that. So that's the speech, and thanks for listening.